Hi everyone, welcome to LitFest 2022. Are you having fun, hopefully? Yeah, awesome. I'm Marissa, one of Lighthouse's admin associates, and this is our, thank you. This is our first visiting author reading and conversation for this year's LitFest. We'll be featuring 3 panelists tonight, but before I introduce everyone, just a couple of quick announcements. For those of you watching online, you're not on camera or mic, so please submit your questions via the Q&A function. You'll find all the links to all of our upcoming author readings and conversations in the chat bar, as well as links to tonight's LitFest at Night reading featuring Lighthouse faculty, and that kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Mountain Time, and that is also free. For those of you here in person, please take any phone calls or conversations outside and save your questions for the end. And at that point, feel free to line up at the microphone that we have over here to ask your questions of the panelists. If you'd like to purchase a book and have it signed by any of our readers tonight, please visit Matter's pop-up store, very cool, our LitFest book selling partner, to make that purchase. And finally, if you're looking, actually, we have another announcement. We're going to have the Queer Creatives reading on Thursday the 16th. If you're interested in reading for that, it's going to be 4:30 to 5:30. Is that right, Sydney? And if you want to read, just plan to read 3 to 5 minutes, and you can talk to Sydney over here about all of the details. It'll be very great. If you're looking for classes and workshops that still have space left, please see the info booth outside or the link in the chat if you're online for our cheat sheet. I'd like to thank SCFD, National Endowment for the Arts, and Colorado Creative Industries for helping to make LitFest 2022 possible, in addition to York Street Yards for the generous use of this wonderful space. And a special thank you to Shop at Matter, our official book-selling partner this year. Awesome, so I'll go ahead and introduce our first reader tonight. That is Vanessa Wah. She is an author and columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. For more than 2 decades, she has been writing about Asia and the diaspora, filling stories from China, Burma, Panama, South Korea, and Ecuador. Her novel, A River of Stars, was named to the Washington Post and NPR's Best Books list of 2018's list. Her short story collection, Deceit and Other Possibilities, a New York Times Editor's Choice, received an Asian Pacific American Award in Literature and was a finalist for a California Book Award and a New American Voices Award. Her novel, which was published in May of this year, Forbidden City, you can purchase it at Matter over there. So I will welcome Vanessa.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Marissa, and to all of you for joining tonight. Doesn't it feel wonderful to be able to gather again? And thanks so much to Lighthouse for hosting Leslie, Jericho, and I. I'm really excited to hear their readings, and again, to Matter for being a pop-up store. So I will be reading from Forbidden City, and it was inspired by a photo I saw about a decade and a half ago. It was of Chairman Mao surrounded by giggling teenage girls. They were dressed in plaid and looked like Bobby Soxers. And it turned out, I was completely fascinated, and it turned out that Mao was a fan of ballroom dancing. In fact, he'd been taught by an American journalist, Agnes Smedley, in 1937, who traveled to Yan'an, a rebel stronghold, where she taught them foxtrot and square dancing. And in the decades that followed, Mao had these special cultural work troops of young women who partnered with him not only on the dance floor, but in the bedroom. When I tried to find more information, his physician said, for these young women, it was the most exhilarating, exciting experience of their lives. I knew it had to be more complicated than that. And so I decided to write Forbidden City, which is told through the eyes of one of these young women, May. Forbidden City. At dawn, Ma filled our wooden tub with hot water. She hadn't bathed me in years and wouldn't have done so again until my wedding day. A few meters away, my sisters slumbered. Later, I'd wonder if they might have been pretending, their parting gift to offer me the privacy I never had there. Ma squatted behind me and poured ladles of water over my head, the scent of dust and sweat rising off in the steam. The drops trickled down my nape, my shoulders, my chest, every part of me cherished. I leaned into her hands. Her breathing became ragged, and I felt her trembling through my body until we were both shaking. "Little May," she murmured. When I tried to turn around, she gripped my shoulders. The water in the tub had gone lukewarm, and I shivered, the hairs raised on the back of my neck and arms. "Ma?" I asked. She didn't answer. She dried me in circling strokes, her hands slowed as if to delay our parting. It was the tenderness I'd always craved from her. Though she must have heard the fear in my voice, she couldn't face me. Not then, maybe not ever again. She would no longer warn me about fox fairies, shapeshifters who roamed the twilight to lure travelers, of disappeared girls, runaway or raped, kidnapped or killed. She knew she had no choice but to give me up, I now see, and didn't want me thinking about the dangers ahead. In that moment, though, I hardened against her, against my fear and my anger. She couldn't help me, and I didn't need her. The picture of the chairman on the wall seemed to nod in the flickering light. He alone would protect me on this journey. Ma helped me step into pants and a tunic that she had patched and pounded clean in the river. She braided my hair into a coil. I gave in to the gentle tugging, in to the mesmerizing firelight, hoping that I would be transformed like the braid, intricate and beautiful and strong as a model revolutionary. Shifting my eyes, I tried to hold still to keep from disturbing my mother's work. Gazing into her wrinkled face, I realized she'd once been my age, leaving her family to marry a man she had never met. She didn't know she would endure beatings from her husband, endure the curse of daughters, the death of sons, and swallow suffering as often as air. If she had known, would she have left her village? That was how we survived, by not knowing what was ahead. She pressed a wooden cup into my hands, a murky brew that gave off the smell of boiled pond scum. Sipping it, I winced, my tongue curling back on itself. She pushed it towards me again, and I half gagged. "What's this?" I asked. Instead of answering, she handed me a pouch filled with tiny lumps the color of bone, their stench even more intense than what she'd brewed. The earthy scent reminded me of dong quai, the golden flowers and sturdy roots we gathered every autumn. A desperate neighbor had once come asking for it after she'd given birth twice within a year. It kept a baby from taking hold. After I started my women's flow, Ba warned me against walking by myself at dusk, telling me to bolt from men who got too close. Why, he never said, but I understood. The curves that made me clumsy and set my running off kilter also invited the attentions of men who could ruin me. "Drink this every morning," Ma now said. I finished the brew and set down the bowl. "Every morning," I repeated, then swirled my tongue against my teeth to get rid of the sour, bitter taste. The party's jeep arrived with a groan and a rattle. As the hens squawked, Ba climbed off the bed, ladled me a bowl of porridge, and dropped in thick slices of salted turnips. I ate while standing, holding the bowl close to my face. He did too. My father's fingers were the finest part of him, nimble whether mending a basket or plucking a radish. As a teenager, he'd left for the provincial capital to make his fortune. Although he wanted to work in a textile factory, he returned a year later, missing his little finger, a failure that still defined him and our family in the village. I was used to the stump, but his long fingers curved around his bowl now seemed lonely, his hand missing its smallest part. He turned away and coughed, wiping at his mouth. My family never said anything about his cough, yet another ailment among us that lingered and festered, like the sores that never quite healed, the scratch that persisted, the irritation in our eyes that went on for so long we forgot we lived any other way. I stared at his hand, the smear of blood undeniable, yet when I looked up, he wordlessly ordered me to ignore it. I set down the bowl, unable to finish more than a few bites. Difficult as this life was, it was all I had known. When Ma brushed down stray hairs at the crown of my head, my resolve disappeared, and the urge to cling to my parents overwhelmed me. Ba lifted my elbow to lead me to the door. Gentle, not rough, this gesture gave me the strength to leave. So May makes her way to the Capitol and joins the ballroom dance troupe. And this scene is on the first night she goes to the chairman's quarters. It's been interesting hearing from readers who've said, though this book is set in 1960s China, how much of the themes of bodily autonomy and power resonate today. I think we're all learning that the past is never as distant as it seems. Even before the chairman touched me, I ached between my legs. My resistance, my glance away. I didn't fight him. I kept my eyes fixed to the ceiling and my body rigid, hoping he would soon finish. The chairman flipped me onto my back and took my nipple into his mouth. My body arched up, yielding to the pull, a current I didn't know I had in me, threatening to knock me over and carry me along. I didn't expect it, didn't know how to stop what was unfurling in me. He didn't linger, though. He crawled down my body, hooked an arm under each leg, and buried his face into me. Stunned, I choked on my screams. The groans he coaxed from me were the sounds of someone I did not know, a wail of mourning, of pleasure. My breath clicked in the back of my throat, shuddering as lights exploded in my head, and I was falling, breaking, tumbling. He rolled off of me, settling beside me. Our panting slowed. I slid along his body, flesh against flesh, and pressed close to his head for a glimpse of his sparse eyelashes, the spiraling cave of his ear, and sunburst of lines radiating from his eyes. I preferred him in fragments. Whole, he overwhelmed me. His eyes distant, he swallowed a handful of golden pills from a bottle on the bedside table. He propped himself up on his elbow. Some things you look at so often, for so long, you miss them. You're opening our eyes to things that we've stopped seeing. He rubbed my thighs, smiling with a bubble of pleasure I would come to recognize as a side effect of the pills that put him to sleep. Within moments of turning off the lights, he was snoring, sprawled on his back, his arms and legs splayed, a man no longer accustomed to sharing his bed. Wondering if I could fall asleep beside him, I edged toward the wall as far as I could go, up against stacks of books. When I undid my hair, my scalp throbbed in relief. Licking my cracked lips, I tasted blood, salty and sacrificial. I'd been spared from getting pregnant tonight, but I'd run out of my mother's tea, and I'd have to find more. Dong Quai grew in the hills of the village, in the moldering damp beneath the forest canopy. The gardens at the lake palaces were vast, though, and such treatments might have been passed down from dynasty to dynasty. An imperial doctor could have secretly cultivated it for the empress and the other court ladies, and maybe it still grew here, the gardeners tending to it as they would any other ornamental flower. Women had other ways to keep a baby from taking hold. In the dance troupe, Busy Shan once explained that you were most likely to get pregnant a couple weeks after your monthly flow. Think of when the sows are bred, how long afterward they go into heat, she said. If you washed yourself with vinegar afterwards, rinsing as far as you could go, you could protect yourself too. You have to wash immediately after, she said. We'd been whispering after lights out in the dorm. Can't teacher Fan help? I asked. You say one word to her and you're gone, Busy Shan said. To avoid getting sent away, the girls tried to take care of it on their own. Is there anything else, Dolly Yu asked shyly. You could offer him a dish of tofu, Busy Shan said. Some men love to eat tofu. They want nothing else. Her talk set off shocked giggles. I hadn't understood the joke then, but all at once I did. Tofu, soft and wet as a woman. What the chairman had done to me tonight, I might persuade him again. and I could do the same to him, which disgusted me so much I could hardly stand to think it, but such an act would keep me from getting pregnant. None of us asked how busy Shan possessed such knowledge, the sort of wisdom we taught one another, girl to girl, without the help of our mothers who didn't want us contemplating such matters. When they were our age, they might have whispered about such secrets. Swallow a jar of tea steeped for 2 days, choke down a mouthful of cold ash, jump from a tree, jump 1,000 times a day for a week. We didn't expect any man to concern himself with how to prevent pregnancy or how to end one. Although I'd never slipped into the fields or down by the river, others in my village must have. The newlywed bride who gave birth not so many months after she married, or the sprite of a classmate sent to live with an ailing aunt. When she returned, people said they could smell the milk on her, the milk meant for the baby she'd given up to another family. In her time away, her waist had thickened, her legs turned stocky and veined, and her high, sweet voice had coarsened. Her parents matched her up with a sickly old man. The widow haunted me most. She hid her pregnancy until she collapsed in the field and gave birth to a baby boy, raw and red as a skinned rabbit. He died a day later. How broken he was afterward. Her arms and legs shambling, her hair matted, a worn-out shoe, a whore. She might have been raped and raped again, every man a suspect. Or she'd been someone's mistress, every wife made vulnerable. She had wronged us all, and in return, we despised her. She had to empty the latrines and tote water to the hilliest fields, stuck with the worst chores, until one day she disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was amazing. Our next reader is Jericho Brown. Jericho is the author of 3 collections of poetry. The Tradition was a finalist in the 2019 National Book Award and the winner of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. The New Testament won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award and was named one of the best of the year by Library Journal, Cold Front, and the Academy of American Poets. His first poetry collection, Please, won the 2009 American Book Award. Join me in welcoming Jericho Brown.
Hello, what a beautiful reading from Vanessa. We should give her another hand. I've known Vanessa so long. It's good to see her. And it's also a pleasure to read with Leslie today. And I should thank Andrea and everyone with the Lighthouse for all of the work that they've been doing to make this possible. And I really want to say a big thank you to my students who actually have a lot of patience with me. And I really appreciate their patience with me. So I'll read you some poems. Can I read you some poems? Prayer of the backhanded, not the palm, not the pear tree switch, not the broomstick, nor the closest extension cord, not his braided belt, but God bless the back of my daddy's hand, which, holding nothing tightly against me and not wrapped in leather, eliminated the air between itself and my cheek. Make full this dimpled cheek, unworthy of its unfisted print, and forgive my forgetting the love of a hand hungry for reflex, a hand that took no thought of its target, like hail from a blind sky, involuntary, fast but brutal in its bruising. Father, I bear the bridge of what might have been a broken nose. I lift to you what was a busted lip. Bless the boy who believes his best beatings lack intention, the mark of the beast. Bring back to life the son who glories in the sin of immediacy, calling it love. God, save the man whose arm, like an angel's invisible wing, may fly backward in fury, whether or not his son stands near. Help me hold in place my blazing jaw as I think to say, excuse me. I'm often asked how I go about making poems, and that's hard to answer because every poem gets made a different way, but I will tell you, every line in this poem comes from, every phrase in this poem comes from something that I heard when I was a kid growing up in the church where I grew up and in the neighborhood I grew up and in the school where I grew up. Autobiography. Keep the line steady. Keep your back straight. Keep coming back for more. Keep fucking with me, Cletus. Keep putting your hands on me like that, and you'll always have a place to lay your head. Keep my waistline down. Keep your figure up. Keep your man happy. Keep a woman crazy. Keep your daddy off your mama, or next time I'm calling the police. Keep these nappy-headed children off my green grass. Keep talking smart if you want to. Keep looking at my man and I'll cut you a new eyelid. Keep looking me in my face when you tell your next lie. Keep on walking, I ain't talking to you anymore. Keep holding that last note. Keep singing while I get the splinter out. Keep singing for Jesus, baby, and everything will be all right. Keep me in your prayers. Keep us in your thoughts. Keep your eyes on the black one. He ain't got no sense. Keep your money in your pocket, Nelson. These hoes giving it away. Keep this one occupied. I'll get his wallet. Keep on living, honey, and you'll get old too. This next poem, y'all are clapping, people. Thank you. This next poem has a title. It's a word that I've only ever heard in Louisiana. And so maybe if you're not from Louisiana, maybe you won't know this. Is anybody from Louisiana but me? No. It's okay. Y'all might get to heaven. Anyway, you could. If you don't know this phrase that is the title of this poem, I think its meaning will become clear to you as I'm reading the poem. 4 in the morning. My mother grew morning glories that spilled onto the walkway toward her porch because she was a woman with land who showed as much by giving it color. She told me I could have whatever I worked for. That means she was an American. But she'd say it was because she believed in God. I am ashamed of America and confounded by God. I thank God for my citizenship in spite of the timer set on my life to write these words. I love my mother. I love black women who plant flowers as sheepish as their sons. By the time the blooms unfurl themselves for a few hours of light, the women who tend them are already at work. Blue. I'll never know who started the lie that we are lazy, but I'd love to wake that bastard up at 4 in the morning, toss him in a truck, and drive him under God past every bus stop in America to see all those black folk waiting to go work for whatever they want. A house? A boy to keep the lawn cut? Some color in the yard? My God, we leave things green. So I mentioned I actually grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. I left there and I lived for a while in New Orleans, Louisiana. I left there and I lived in Houston, Texas. When I left in Houston, Texas, I moved to San Diego, California, which is where I found out that I have an accent. And I also found out that there were all these words and phrases that I grew up with that turn out not to be real words. One of those words is the title of this next poem. That word is nim. If you're from the South, maybe you make use of the word nim. Nim means that person and everyone you associate with that person. To put it in context for you, if you see somebody you hadn't seen in a long time, when you knew them maybe from high school or something like that, and you knew their family, when you see them again, after years of seeing them, you might say to them, "Hey, how you doing? How is your mama?" And them. That's how the word works. And them. They said to say good night and not goodbye. Unplugged the TV when it rained. They hid money in mattresses, so to sleep on decisions. Some of their children were not their children. Some of their parents had no birth dates. They could sweat a cold out of you. They'd wake without an alarm telling them to. Even the short ones reached certain shelves. Even the skinny cooked animals too quick to catch. And I don't care how ugly one of them arrived. That one got married to somebody fine. They fed families with change and wiped their kitchens clean. Then another century came. People like me forgot their names. I wrote this next poem after finding out and being confounded by the very long list of people who have supposedly committed suicide while in police custody. That list includes folks like Jesus Huerta in North Carolina, who, after having been patted down while handcuffed on the walk from the police cruiser to where he was to be booked, to the building where he was to be booked, somehow supposedly managed to shoot himself in the back corner of his head. Victor White III in Louisiana, where I'm from, who, after having been patted down, sitting in the back seat of a police cruiser while handcuffed, somehow managed to shoot himself in his upper back. Sandra Bland in Texas, who, after a day of fighting for her life, hung herself with a trash bag in a cell where there is video footage of her. That video footage has technical difficulties. Something happens and that video footage goes out, and the coroner says that feed must have gone out at just the moment that Sandra Bland must have hung herself with a trash bag. Bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass, more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it the same way most Americans do. I promise you. Cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain. Say thank you. Say I'm sorry. I don't know whose side you're on, but I am here for the people who work in grocery stores that glow in the morning and close down for deep cleaning at night, right up the street and in cities I mispronounce, in towns too tiny for my big black car to quit, and in every wide corner of Kansas where going to school means at least one field trip to a slaughterhouse. I want so little, another leather-bound book, a gimlet with a lavender gin, bread so good when I taste it, I can tell you how it's made. I'd like us to rethink what it is to be a nation. I'm in a mood about America today. I have PTSD about the Lord. God save the people who work in grocery stores. They know a bit of glamour is a lot of glamour. They know how much it costs for the eldest of us to eat. Save my loves and not my sentences. Before I see them, I draw a mole near my left dimple. Add flair to the smile they can't see behind my mask. I grin or lie, or maybe I wear the mouth of a beast. I eat wild animals while some of us grow up knowing what gnocchi is. The people who work at the grocery don't care. They say, thank you. They say, sorry, we don't sell motor oil anymore. With a grief so thick you could touch it. Go on, touch it. It is early. It is late. They have washed their hands. They have washed their hands for you. And they take the bus home. I'm reading retrospectively, which is to say I'm reading from my first book, Please. My second book, the New Testament. My mother's still angry with me about that title. And from my most recent book, The Tradition. One of the features of this most recent book is a form I invented called the Duplex. The Duplex is at once a hustle, a sonnet, and a blues poem. And I think you'll hear those elements come through when I read this example of one for you now. Duplex. I begin with love, hoping to end there. I don't want to leave a messy corpse. I don't want to leave a messy corpse full of medicines that turn in the sun. Some of my medicines turn in the sun. Some of us don't need hell to be good. Those who need most need hell to be good. What are the symptoms of your sickness? Here is one symptom of my sickness. Men who love me are men who miss me. Men who leave me are men who miss me in the dream where I am an island. In the dream where I am an island, I grow green with hope. I'd like to end there. I'd like to finish with some love poems. Can I read you some love poems? You know, you have to ask for consent. The only thing you may want to know before I read this first one is that Billy Strayhorn wrote Lush Life while he was still a teenager. It's one of my favorite songs, Lush Life. And almost everyone that I love has a version of it. My favorite version of Lush Life is Natalie Cole. Obviously, her father, Nat King Cole, has a really brilliant version of Lush Life. But I love to hear different singers try to sing a song so difficult. You know, even Queen Latifah has a version of Lush Life. And it's not bad. It's a very difficult song, very complex, very hard to play, very hard to sing. Every time I think about the fact that Billy Strayhorn wrote Lush Life when he was still a teenager, I really hate Billy Strayhorn. Track 1, Lush Life. The woman with the microphone sings to hurt you, to see you shake your head. The mic may as well be a leather belt. You drive to the center of town to be whipped by a woman's voice. You can't tell the difference between a leather belt and a lover's tongue. A lover's tongue might call you bitch, a term of endearment where you come from, a kind of compliment preceded by the word sing in certain nightclubs. A lush little tongue you have, you can yell, sang bitch and I love you with a shot of Patron at the end of each phrase from the same bar stool every Saturday night night, but you can't remember your father's leather belt without shaking your head. That's what satisfies her, the woman with the microphone. She does not mean to entertain you, and neither do I. Speak to me in a lover's tongue. Call me your bitch, and I'll sing the whole night long. Two more poems. I love poetry so much. I hope that's clear. I love the only thing I love more than poetry is cuddling. So I love cuddling so much. I gotta get back home. Anyway, so I'm really, you're not supposed to. You'll never hear another poet say this, but I am really proud of this poem because it's about cuddling. And when do you get two of your favorite things in the same place at the same time? Stand. Peace on this planet, or guns glowing hot. We lay there together as if we were getting something done. It felt like planting a garden or planning a meal for a people who still need feeding. All that touching, or barely touching, not saying much, not adding anything. The cushion of it, the skin and occasional sigh. All seemed like work worth mastering. I'm sure somebody died while we made love. Somebody killed somebody black. I thought then of holding you as a political act. I may as well have held myself. We didn't stand for one thought, didn't do a damn thing. And though you left me, I'm glad we didn't. And I will, thank you. And I will finish, thank you. I'll finish with a poem. I'll finish with the last poem. It's the last poem in the book. It's also the last duplex in the book. It's the last duplex in the book, but there is another layer of form attached to it. It is not only a duplex, it is also, I told you earlier, a duplex is a hustle, a sonnet, and a blues poem at once. It is also, this poem is also a cento. As you know, a cento takes all of its lines from other poems, usually by other poets. This cento is a little different as it is only made up of the lines from the other duplexes in the book, because I'm a nerd. Oh, and I should say, this is the perfect audience to make this clear. There are all these people, I love it when people joke about, which one's better, poetry, fiction, nonfiction, playwright. I love that, so funny. But, it's really, really funny, but only poets can read you the last page of their book. Okay, so. Duplex, cento. My last love drove a burgundy car. Color of a rash, a symptom of sickness. We were the symptoms, the road, our sickness. None of our fights ended where they began. None of the beaten end where they begin. Any man in love can cause a messy corpse, but I didn't want to leave a messy corpse obliterated in some lilied field. Stench obliterating lilies of the field, the murderer, young and unreasonable. He was so young, so unreasonable, steadfast and awful, tall as my father, steadfast and awful. My tall father was my first love. He drove a burgundy car. Thank you so much.
I'm not as tall as Jericho Brown, although I wish I was. Okay. Thank you so much, Jericho. Let's give it up for him again. That was so good. Awesome. All right. Our last reader and visiting author for the night before our Q&A portion is Leslie Jamison. Leslie is the New York Times bestselling author of The Recovering, The Empathy Exams, Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and a novel, The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, and her work has appeared in numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Harper's, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. She lives in Brooklyn with her daughter and teaches at Columbia University. Please welcome Leslie Jamison.
What a thrill and a pleasure to read with Vanessa and Jericho. Vanessa, your reading was gripping and really actually quite wrenching in the context of, as you say, the history that we're living through that reminds us how all the other histories are never far away. And Jericho, trying to locate you in the room, it was so stunning to read. I can actually remember all the visceral sensations in my body when I first heard you read A Prayer for the Backhanded at Live, which was at Red Rocks outside of Vegas many years ago. And I can remember the feel of the night, and I was wearing my daughter, who was just like 3 months old, around me at that time, and how deeply that poem just filled every cell of my body, and it did again today. So such a pleasure to read with both of you and Andrea and Lighthouse. It's always, always, always such an honor to be part of this community that you put together. And I was telling my students this morning, my wonderful students, I'm so excited about this group. They had to listen to me monologue about various forms of masculinity at play in Lord of the Rings for a while today, but they were up for it, and I think a little into it. I don't know, you can ask them, but I feel like I always come here and I have these experiences that I remember for the rest of my life. And I was telling them that people throw around words like family and community, but I knew in March 2020 when I came down with COVID and was taking care of my daughter, and this box of pears, thank you so much, this box of pears showed up in the mail from Andrea, that I was like, oh my God, Lighthouse truly is this amazing multi-tendrilled instrument of care and inclusion. And so I'm just so grateful to be back. And what I'll do, I won't read too much because I want to talk a little bit with these fine folks I've been reading with, but I'm going to read from a little bit from the beginning of a recent essay called Dreamers in Broad Daylight. And the title of the essay is taken from Sigmund Freud, and he wrote a lecture about daydreaming in which he called daydreamers dreamers in broad daylight. And I've spent my whole life obsessively daydreaming. This essay is about that and about desire. And I spent a few years basically obsessively just thinking about daydreaming. It seemed, sometimes I get really excited to write essays about those subjects that feel like they're knitted into every moment of our being, but we don't talk about them that much. And my life as a daydreamer felt like one of those, like I was always living this secret life that I never spoke of. And what would it be like to try to speak of that life? So this is a little bit of that piece. Once upon a time, I met a stranger, and in my mind, we lived an entire life together. Not just one life, but many lives. Not just once, but many times. This particular stranger was a lawyer in Portland. I'd come to his office because someone told me there was going to be a protest. There was no protest. I ended up sitting in a corporate conference room with this lawyer in his sage green fleece vest. We talked about the pipeline that was getting laid near tribal lands in Standing Rock. Beneath his justifications, I could sense a white man's deep sorrow for the crimes of his country. That sorrow was the part of him I imagined building a life with. My conversation with this lawyer lasted only an hour, but by the time I left, I'd already begun to spin an elaborate fantasy about how our single conversation might change his life. It would force a reckoning with his conscience. He'd remember why he went into law in the first place. He would look up my website. The next time he came to New York, we would have a tryst at a swank midtown hotel, maybe the one with the burger joint behind the red velvet curtain. He'd leave his marriage. The internet told me he was married, but no matter. I was married too. The rapid current of my daydream flowed easily around our spouses like two boulders in a river. We would move into a craftsman bungalow painted the same shade of sage green as his fleece vest. He would save the world by fighting environmental injustice. I would save the world by writing literary essays. We'd watch prestige television once a week. On all the other nights, we wouldn't watch TV. We'd have too much to talk about. These daydreams occupied the better portion of my flight east. Back home, they filled all the crevices of my domestic labors. They followed me for weeks as I walked along the damp sidewalks of Brooklyn, past brownstones whose lit windows exposed perfect lives in which no one needed to dream about living anywhere else, which was my ultimate daydream, imagining a life in which I no longer daydreamed at all. I've spent my whole life daydreaming. It embarrasses me to think of tallying the hours. It feels like ingratitude. It feels like infidelity. It's often been about infidelity. I've daydreamed while walking, while running, while drinking, while smoking, sitting in the Boston cold, 17 years old, daydreams spouting from a broken heart. I've daydreamed on every form of transport. Something about commuting feels conducive to daydreaming, the pockets of time in between our commitments, and the fact of the body in motion, neither here nor there, available for an elsewhere. I've daydreamed to music and in silence, in solitude and in company. It's hardly exceptional. Studies have found that daydreaming accounts for between a quarter and a half of our waking hours, that we do it every few minutes during nearly every activity except sex. And who believes that study? Like, people must also be daydreaming during sex, but another essay. Eric Klinger, a psychologist at the University of Minnesota, claims that daydreams comprise about half the average person's thoughts. My first daydreams were crushes. In one fantasy, the blonde baseball player from my physics class walked up to the front of the room and announced against a backdrop of velocity and momentum equations that he wanted to go to prom with me. She might seem quiet, he would tell the class, but once you get to know her, she really has so much to say. Sometimes I'd revise midstream. He wouldn't say, she really has so much to say. That was something my middle-aged mom would say. He'd say, she's pretty awesome. In college, when I worked part-time as an assistant to an immigration lawyer, I daydreamed about making an important discovery that would help secure asylum for one of our clients. I would rush into the courtroom with neatly highlighted papers. The family would be saved. The courtroom would react with hushed voices. Who was that? When I restricted my eating, my daydreams grew more restricted too. They started to be almost entirely about eating. I looked up restaurant menus and imagined eating all the dishes they listed: chocolate bread pudding with rum caramelized bananas, or Ritz cracker crusted scrod with herb potatoes. My hunger felt so bottomless it could be satisfied only in fantasies. Near the end of my marriage, I spent more and more time in my fantasies. My daydreams were imagined affairs or else counterfactuals in which I'd married someone else. As the psychoanalyst Adam Phillips argues, any ideal, any preferred world is a way of asking, what kind of world are we living in that makes this the solution? What would the symptom have to be for this to be the self-cure? My daydreams were the destruction and the oxygen. They were a whispered diagnosis, a truth serum. After we eventually separated, I looked back on my daydreams with a mixture of gratitude and shame. Had they been toxic evasions, a way of disappearing into fantasy to avoid the work of saving my marriage? Or were they necessary articulations of desire, something less like cowardice and more like a summons? I'm going to read one last section and then call it quits. Over dinner with strangers in Rochester on a work trip a few months after my eventual separation, I brought up the subject of daydreaming because I was desperate to change the subject. The subject was our actual lives. My hosts were asking about my husband, our young daughter, and I didn't want to tell them we were getting divorced. I was tired of saying it's for the best or it's very painful in a perfectly calibrated tone that suggested both sadness and composure. My hosts were two professors who had been married for several decades. The woman was very talkative. Her husband was not. I started doing that thing where I projected unrealistic levels of domestic bliss onto this pair while simultaneously suspecting I wouldn't have been able to stand being married to either one of them. At a certain point, I thought, fuck it, and started asking them about their daydreams. The talkative woman was adamant. She didn't have daydreams. Did I? How could I possibly have enough time to daydream? She certainly didn't. I don't know, I said lamely. I'd do it on the subway. At this point in my life, I was the single mother of a 16-month-old baby with a full-time job as a professor and another full-time job as a writer and a third full-time job as a person getting divorced, so I didn't necessarily have a lot of free time, but I found time for daydreaming anyway. I've never not found time for daydreaming. The woman in Rochester nailed my shame precisely, or rather, one of my shames, the shame of indolence, leisure, privilege, and waste. She asked, "What do you daydream about?" I had a perverse impulse to say the most embarrassing thing. I said, "Sometimes I daydreamed about winning a Pulitzer." The talkative woman said, "There you go. I would never feel entitled to do that," which made me feel ashamed in an entirely different way. In the midst of our fervent back and forth, the woman's quiet husband said, very quietly, "I daydream all the time." He spoke so quietly I barely heard him, but his wife heard him. She asked him, as she'd asked me, what he daydreamed about. He said nothing. She said, "Go on, you can say, I don't mind." He fiddled with the handle of his coffee cup. "No, really," she said, "you can say." But he didn't say, and I was glad. I wanted him to keep his daydreams for himself. I wanted him to have something that was just his own. Thanks.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you, all three of you, Jericho, Vanessa, Leslie. This was so great. Let's give them another round of applause. Yeah. And we'll start our Q&A portion, so I'll have you three come up and sit with me up here. And for the audience, if you have any questions, we'll go ahead and get that started. You can ask questions at this microphone, and in the chat, I will be passing along questions. So if you want to get started with that, come join me on stage. Perfect. So while we wait for people to ask their burning questions, I'm going to be selfish and ask my first one. So many of the pieces that you guys have written makes me think of James Baldwin when he spoke about the moral responsibility of the artist. What would each of you say is the moral responsibility of the writer in today's day and age? I told you I was going to ask you a James Baldwin question, Jericho.
Well, yeah, you did. So I guess I'll go first because I'm ready. You gave me. I didn't know it was going to be that question. You know, the other thing he said was, that he told the truth, and I imagine that's still the only responsibility I have is to tell the truth. I also think telling the truth has a requirement. It requires discipline and it requires integrity. So I would say yes to that. But not because writers are activists automatically, though they might be, but I don't think it's because of that. I think you're writing, I hate using the language we have, so, forgive me for this. This is a misuse of language. But your writing's not going to be any good if you don't tell the truth. You know?
Very true.
So in my journalism and in my fiction, I've always tried to shine a light onto untold stories that might inspire a change in thinking and a change in action. That said, what I begin with is the character and their circumstances and building out who that character is. So I think writing to say with a mission of I don't think our goal is to write a polemic unless that's what you're aiming to do. But whatever genre, and to tell the truth, to be honest, and to tell those stories to tell the story that no one else can. So,
Yeah.
in only the way you can tell it.
I'm about to fall over if I really get into this mic, but I love both of those answers, and maybe it's a cop-out to answer a question including a Baldwin quote with a paraphrase from Baldwin himself, so forgive me for that faux pas if it is one, but I have always loved and tried to live by the idea that the job of literature is to lay bare the questions that have been obscured by the answers, and I think to me, probably my two North Stars when it comes to writing are related, I think, to moral responsibility, which are the gods of complexity and specificity. And I think that if you follow complexity and you follow the specifics, which often actually the specifics of a situation, whether it's from your own life or from the world around you or from art or from the life of another or from an untold story or from, if you follow specificity and you listen to it closely and you're curious and you're willing to see your own assumptions unseated, it will carry you to complexity. And I think the articulation of those complexities as best you can, as best I can, as best any of us can is part of that moral responsibility of the artist.
Absolutely. That's perfectly said. Thank you so much. Do we have any audience questions? I have tons of questions, so I can. Okay.
They want nothing to do with us.
They're all just intimidated, really.
I want to ask about community, because I think it's on the forefront of a lot of our minds, and just being here for LitFest, it's certainly, it's making me think about the other things besides writing and publishing that we do. And I just wondered if there is anything you can talk about with your own specific literary communities that you have created, that you participate in. What have they done for your writing, and how have they served you?
Well, I guess I can say a few words. I mean, when I think about literary community, I guess I think about a few different forms of community. Probably the primary one in my life has to do with my life as a teacher and my relationships with students over the many years that I've had the privilege to teach. And when I think about what work happens in those communities, I think a lot about the sense of gratitude I have for actually learning from my students as much as I teach them anything, and this constant opportunity to witness other minds, witness what other minds are curious about, learn things from them that are lessons that I often didn't even know or realize that I needed to learn about my own writing. And I also think about, my life as a teacher and a learner in that act of teaching has taken place in classrooms. I teach in Ivy League classrooms, but it's taken place in a lot of other places too. I'm really committed to thinking about how storytelling transforms tellers and hearers. And so, when I think about literary community, I also think about the classes that I have taught and mentored at a place called The Bridge in New York City for the past 5 years. It's a transitional housing facility, but committed to working with a population that's wrestling with mental illness and substance dependence. And what I witness in those rooms, actually digitally and embodied, reminds me in this daily, visceral way why storytelling matters and actually how it can change a person's conception of self, or how listening to the story of another can change your conception of the world. So it's that visceral reawakening to the possibilities of what language can do and what it can be that comes to me through community in a way that it couldn't come to me if I was just engaging with my own work or my own computer screen.
So I had a mentor in grad school, Susan Straight, and she would tell us to hook each other up. Not hook up, though there was probably some of that as well, but to care for each other, to have each other's backs, to go to each other's readings, to organize readings, to all the way to pass along opportunities. And that's something that an ethos in the way I exist in various literary communities and in the workshops I teach. I'm always so excited when I hear years after I taught a workshop that they're still meeting. And that's something, an opportunity here for the Lit Fest Festival, that this is just the beginning, I hope you all realize. And then some of you already know each other, but there's just so much possibility. It's always, on the first night of a festival, I'm always so excited to sort of look over the crowd and think like some lifelong friendships are about to be made. So, and I also think about peer mentorship. My friend Angie Chuang, who's in the audience, we really came up together as journalists, and then she's in creative nonfiction, I'm in fiction, and just the ways that we've looked after each other. Like, it's important to have mentors, but a peer mentor someone you come up with at the same time, you can text them with a freak out. You can text them with, can you look at this tomorrow if you have time? And so it's so invaluable to find your people. And then just finally, I'll end with, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. I belong to something called the Writer's Grotto that some of you may have heard of. And I remember I went there, I joined as a fellow, and I remember the first day I was there, I saw all these book covers hanging on the wall, and I felt like a fraud, because at the time, my agent at the time wasn't able to sell my novel, and I thought, I don't belong here, I'm a fraud. But at lunch, a woman who had written a successful memoir, just to me, it seemed almost casual. She said, oh, I wrote a novel and it didn't sell, and it floored me. Of course, I knew logically that writer's life had ups and downs, but the very fact of her openness and her vulnerability made me realize the importance of commiserating and celebrating when there's time for that. And in fact, the Writer's Grotto, as a surprise, for my launch in San Francisco, they did a braid flash mob. They all discussed secretly and showed up with twin braids like the cover of my book, A Braid Brigade. So,
That's amazing.
Yeah. So that's happy to keep evangelizing and talking about literary community in all ways.
So great.
This is actually a very deep and very important question. I think we're not aware just how much, because most of what we do is in a room alone or in a coffee shop with a bunch of people we wish would shut up or something. Right? But ultimately, it's very solitary kind of work. And yet, we have this expectation, this prayer, actually, that we can return from that work to someone or someones. Do y'all know what I mean? And also that we leave those someone or someones and we go back to that work and they don't freak out while we're gone, right? They hold a place for us and a space for us. I think the thing that was most useful to me in communities that I was in early on as a writer, I was in the No Mo Literary Society in New Orleans, which was a black workshop. And I went to Cave Canem when I was really young. And I think both of those workshops were really useful to me because they really encouraged people losing their minds on the page. And not only did they encourage it, they outwardly reacted to it. And I think that was really useful to me. When you did something well that even you could not imagine doing, they would recognize that and they would lose their faces. They would, girl, you better write, oh, look who snapped. You know what I mean? And I think that becomes for me the most important thing a community to do, because that's what changes your ceilings into floors. You want to be in an environment where the crazy stuff becomes normal so that you have some more crazy stuff to reach for. Do you know what I mean? Is what I think. But that can only happen when people acknowledge, you lost your mind. You better write. Look who snapped. Do you understand what I'm saying? I will also just quickly say, as important as benefiting communities are, it is also important that we keep them safe. If you're in, this is a community, obviously, the Lighthouse. I can't count the number of people here. It would take me some time. I could, but it would take me some time we don't have. Sometimes a writer community might only be 10 people. If you're in a community of 10 people and in 7 months you've had sex with 7 of them, you're not interested in safety. That's just true. Do y'all understand what I mean? And I don't care how much everybody liked having the sex. It's dangerous. Do y'all know it's dangerous to the community? Even if it's not, do y'all understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. So you have to, I think, in community, it's very difficult. It's like, falling in love. You have to be vulnerable. And at the same time, if you're going to be vulnerable, everybody else has to understand, we're being vulnerable. Let's protect that. Let's make that worth it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, all 3 of you. It's very encouraging. I think we have time for a couple more, so if you have any questions in the audience, feel free to come up. I'm going to ask, while you make your way up, we have one from our very own Torrin Jensen from Lighthouse in the chat. He's wondering, have you ever written something true that was verifiably not true?
I don't know what that means.
That's a Torrin question.
Well, I'll say this. In my second book, I have a brother, but I don't have a brother.
Ah.
But I needed to say brother in order to say what I had to say. Yeah. And because it's poetry, I didn't need that brother to be a metaphor. I need things in poems to be on the ground. I think it's very important that we keep our poems on the ground, we keep things real. Yeah. And if we can keep things real, they can turn toward being surreal and they can have other meaning for other people. So I had this brother in this book, and a lot happened to him too. Mm-hmm. But then I had to write this a lot. Like he got killed in the book. It was awful. But I think of that book as being very true, and I think of the word brother as being, for me, in my life, a very true. There was a time in black people's lives when real life, I'm not making it up, black people would pass each other on the street and they say, hey brother, hey sister. They didn't know each other. They really did that. Do you know what I mean? And so that word has a certain kind of importance and feels like a certain kind of belonging to me. And so therefore, in that book, it is true, in spite of the fact that character is not a factual character.
Yeah.
I think that answers.
I think that's perfect.
I had to write this poem at the end of the book, there's this poem about how I don't have a brother after all, which I think might have upset some people.
Might have.
In the same book?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I felt like, I better say this because maybe I don't like that people do that to poems. People always want poems to be nonfiction, which isn't fair because they're not.
It's true.
And they use metaphor. If you're using metaphor, you're lying. If you use a metaphor, you have lied. Metaphors are lies. That's all a metaphor is indeed a lie.
Very true.
I'll just say that, with Forbidden City, that I consider research to be the floor and not the ceiling, to use that metaphor, and that it's a jumping off point, and that in the novel that there's a lot I left out that was, say, almost too much into the weeds, but that's been covered by historians. I feel like where fiction could really flourish is where the official record ends. And so I know this is not quite Torrin's question about verifiably untrue, but it's not verifiably true either. So, and I think especially if we're writing stories about people who have been erased or dismissed, that's this whole is it true, is it not true? My intent was to write something that, again, would never be told if not for this effort. So.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. I think we're going to take 1 or 2 more audience questions, and then we'll be finished up. So yeah, if you want to come on up.
Okay, so my name's Akira, and I'm an undergrad at the University of Illinois. I'm a queer writer of color, and being in a school and field that's predominantly white has been rather difficult, and I've suffered a good amount of imposter syndrome. So my question would be, as writers of color, what have you learned in establishing yourself in your careers and dealing with imposter syndrome, especially as you continue to serve as inspirations to marginalized communities?
That's a great question.
I think Jericho touched upon this in terms of finding the right community, realizing that the readers in your workshop, they're just the readers in your workshop, but they might not be the heart readers that you carry lifelong. And those workshops are necessary at the time, say, for getting your degree, but there are other ways of finding community through summer conferences like Kundiman or Lambda or Voices of Our Nation, or even the Grotto. If you're in the Bay Area, we're doing Rooted and Written in August. It's a free conference for writers, for and by writers of color. So I think it can feel like sometimes it can feel like there's no one like me or there's no one with my sensibility, but I think as long as you keep doing the work that's important to you, I'm something that I'm always mindful of, like even when it feels like I'm writing into the void, if that work can somehow make someone else tell their truth, tell their story too, then we're in this whole chain of people, of writers, and understanding that lineage that is greater than, say, your present moment can be really powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Kira. You were here and now you're not there anymore. For your question, can I just say this? I think it's a really good idea just to understand that you are not the first of anything. Even if you are, just pretend you're not the first of anything, right? There have been queer writers of color before you. And that can become your community. That can also remind you that you're not posing as anything. You're a student at a school, getting a degree, studying writing. Do you know what I mean? And I think if we think of ourselves in terms of being in a larger tradition, then we're always in a position where we're too busy giving because we understand like, oh, that, this comes from, like quite literally, it's so real, y'all. Like, I'm sorry about this. Like, I'm sorry it sounds crazy. But Langston Hughes dreamed of me and yet could not completely dream of me. He didn't have everything that I have that would allow for dreams that I could exist. Do you know what I mean? And so my job then is to dream of somebody that does not exist and to work as if one day they will. And to understand they'll be a way better writer than I am, right? That's one way, I think, to think about that. Yeah.
Nice. Awesome. I think we can maybe take one more question. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, if you want to come on up.
I'm Mary Catherine, and my question relates actually to this last one and also to the question of community. What about your relationship with isolation? And not solitude, but when you are trying to either find a sensibility or kind of find a voice where you've been, you're borrowing and you're echoing, and that kind of happens naturally, and community can foster that. But then there's a point where maybe you have to kind of feel like you can isolate yourself from that to find that voice that wants to speak. I know this is a really esoteric question, but I guess just like, whatever that feels like to you, could you speak to that process as well?
Well, I don't know how fully this will answer your question, but I love the way that you framed that sense of tension or dilemma in your question around sort of feeling suffused by voices and by various kinds of company, as we've heard about so eloquently tonight, and then what it means in that landscape to find a voice. And I guess what came to mind as I was listening to your question was an experience. I feel like my evolution as a writer has not been a steady or consistent thing, but more of a punctuated thing where I'll sort of trudge along in a groove that might feel static or worn, and then something ruptures or breaks open, or sometimes it feels like the floor dropping out. It doesn't always feel glorious, but actually when the crack opens up in the earth and I fall through it, it's like I'm in some new voice or some new way of speaking, and that becomes it's like I've found the language I need to write the next project. And the first time that happened was when I was like very enmeshed in a certain kind of writing community. I was getting my MFA, and I, dutiful little pleaser that I think had totally fallen into that. Workshops are glorious things that I believe in, like with every bone in my body, but I do think there can be a danger, and I think workshops can talk about this really effectively and honestly, of like trying to write to please the room, right? And trying to write the consensus story that everybody's going to sign off on and say, like, this is great, or the consensus poem, or whatever, to write the poem that's for everyone, when all I think we're really writing for is the program, the piece of writing the poem, the story, the essay that's going to, make somebody's face go wild with that feeling, right? Or we're writing for communities that are bigger, as Vanessa was saying, than just like the people in the room around us. But anyway, I was writing very terrible stories that were not reaching for any of those things. They wanted everybody to say, this is really good, And then I reached this point where, personally, I was just kind of like falling apart in a low-key, like 22-year-old way, where I was like drinking a lot. I had been broken up with in a way that I found really embarrassing. I was drunk calling everybody and being like, I'm more attractive than him, right? It's just like a kind of banal, bad place. And I was like, I don't want to write a breakup story, because who needs a breakup story? It's so predictable and it's not great literature, and I'm writing for the ages, et cetera, et cetera. But then I was like, this is actually the only thing that I think I have to say. And it was like in that moment, that was actually the story that I had to write. And that actually was the thing I had to say. And I found somehow in that moment, like the only decent short story I've ever written in my entire life, I wrote then, because I actually somehow was able, through enough like box wine or whatever, to come to a place where I wasn't writing so that everybody would say, good job, you're a good writer. I was writing because I felt this deep sense of being kind of broken open, and I was trying to find words for it. So I think sometimes when you can touch the urgency of a subject enough, for me, that's one of the things that can, whatever the subject is, however shameful or trivial or whatever it feels like it's mattering is, that when you can find that, there's a way that it can kind of quiet some of those voices that crowd in around the edges of like touching that voice that can speak inside.
Awesome. Leslie said this thing in her reading about how she's a full-time educator, a full-time writer, a full-time mom, and there are these jobs. Everybody's got jobs. So I think, I hope this begins to answer your question. It's a good idea to know what your jobs are. And it's a very good idea to know where they intersect. And it's a really good idea to do your job. Do your fucking job. Stop doing things that are not. Stop doing other people's jobs. Now, here's another thing, like if you were to sit down and you write a list of all your jobs, some of those jobs are jobs you don't want to have, and some of them you can't quit. But some of them you can. Quit the jobs you don't want. Stop having careers you don't, why are you in charge of stuff you don't even want to be in charge of, girl? Do you know, let it go. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's a good idea to know what your jobs are, to know where those jobs intersect, to do those jobs, to do what you want to do, to make sure your jobs are things that you want to do. And then if you can do that, then you can sort of understand when you're not doing that, you're relaxing. When you're not doing that, the only other thing you have to do is binge watch Inventing Anna. Like do you know what I mean? Like do your job and then, take care of yourself. Like, fall in love, make love, eat horribly like me. Do you know what I mean? But, other than that, you should be doing your job. And then everything else takes care of itself as long as you're not doing other jobs.
Great.
And just to your question of voice and knowing like how to develop like your voice that's like no one else and not unduly influenced, I do remember in college I was writing these terrible ripoffs of Anne Beatty of like lonely young women in New York, and I'd only been there once in high school because I thought like that's where literature with an L took place, and that's what I should write. But it went back. It was only after reading more from various diasporas that I realized like actually there is value in the story that only I can tell or only you could tell. And so I think the question of voice, like have I settled upon it or have you settled upon it? Sometimes you don't realize it until it's in retrospect. And that's okay. Like you don't know what you don't know until you go through that process. And just one other thought that I think every book you write feels like you're learning how to write that book. So even though there's a particular sensibility you might have with each book, like the tones of each, my 3 books couldn't be more different and yet more alike in some ways. So it's about figuring out where that voice sits, that North Star in terms of like what you're most passionate about and what your concerns are in the world.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. This was amazing. Thank you all for being here. This was really great.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you.
Thanks for wonderful moderating.
Absolutely. So thank you all for being here. After this, if you want to head outside, Leslie, Vanessa, and Jericho are going to be doing a signing. So if you don't have their books, go get them or have them signed. So you can head outside for that. And then after this, we will have our Lit Fest at Night reading with our Lighthouse faculty. Thank you all so much.
You did a great job. Yeah.
I am, yeah.
No, I'll just grab my bag.
Well, a little bit of both, hopefully. It's about work that they've done before. It's today and tomorrow, but I'm also doing, I'm like still trying to think.
But Andrea has my phone since I'm excited about it, so I'll get it and then I'm going to move it to you.
Yeah, that's, thank